What do you see when you don't know what to see? That's what I think music is about. Now, I'll tell you why. So, what music does, think of Bach. Now, what he does is he takes this temporal span, and then he builds these complex patterns across it, right? And some of the patterns go like this, and some of them go like this, and some of them go like this, and there's a pattern here, and a pattern here, and a pattern here, and a pattern there, and some of them are going backwards. I mean, the guy's complicated, you know. It's stunning, actually. He actually wrote a song that you can play upside down and backwards, and it's the same song. Man, it's unbelievable. Bach wrote so much music that it would take a talented copyist, someone who just copies music, 40 years of 8-hour days just to transcribe it. Anyways, Bach, he presents you with this landscape. It's an abstracted landscape, but what the landscape says is, look at all the cool patterns. There's just layers and layers of them, and then he asks your perceptual system. He says, here, focus on this one. There's this little interesting thing happening. It's partly patterned and predictable, but not too much, because then it's like a computer wrote it. It's patterned and predictable, but it has this little edge of novelty on it, and that's interesting. That novelty keeps you gripped, and you can pick out the patterns. It's as if you're turning them into auditory objects. Well, with Bach, you can do that at 10 levels at the same time. It's an analog. It's an analog of the real world. And you get that as soon as you stop thinking of the real world as a simple place of objects. It's not. It's a complex place of patterns. And those patterns shift and change in different situations and with different temporal frames of reference. And that's what music is telling you. And that's why it's so deeply meaningful, because music says to you, here, this is actually the structure of the world. Beyond your simple perceptions, this is the structure of the world. Well, that's kind of what I figured out when I was making this thing, you know. I wanted it to kind of rotate a bit. I don't know if it's successful. It's actually a cube that's set on edge. So that's the edge of the cube there. And so you can see into the cube. It's a spiral at the same time. And then it's a tunnel. Just imagine a tunnel that's going back to a point, and it's fragmented into these 4 things here. And so it's like things are bursting out of the middle of this tunnel, and that's what music is like, right? There's this just constant onslaught of new, complex, patterned forms. I thought, what does that mean? It means something. Listen to music. I think, this means something. This means something. I can feel it, like I can experience it. And I say, well, if you experience it, it's real. Or you might think, well, the meaning of music isn't real. Well, it depends on what you mean. Right? It depends on your presuppositions. I think what means things is real. There's this old idea, you know, this is a funny little turn of phrase, but I like it. You know, materialists, they think the world's made out of matter, right? Well, this perspective isn't predicated on that idea. This perspective is predicated on the idea that reality is made out of what matters, and music expresses what matters. Well, and then you think, well, is there any reason to think that way? Well, and I would say, well, Solzhenitsyn, he said, taking a page from Dostoevsky, said, beauty will save the world. It's a funny thing, because Solzhenitsyn is actually one of the people who helped save the world, because his truth was at least in part responsible for knocking down the tyranny in the Soviet Union. You know, so maybe he's someone worth listening to. Well, what's meaning worth? Well, if you listen to music, you know. You can experience what music does to you. It's direct. It's in your own experiential field. The problem is you can't exactly quantify or qualify it by referring to other people, because it's a personal experience. But just because it's a personal experience doesn't mean it isn't real. Pain's real, or isn't it? Well, I tell you, if you're in enough pain, you're not going to be rationally arguing about that point. You know, we have an idea in our culture that it's what we know that saves us, in a way, you know, that keeps us able to cope with all of the pressures of being alive. And that's true, you know. What we know is very, very useful, but it's not useful enough, because no matter how much you know, there are certain problems that you still have, and they're eternal problems. There are the problems that you're fragile in all sorts of ways, mentally fragile, physically fragile, emotionally fragile. You know, you're not as good looking as you might be, etc., etc. And no matter how much you know, none of that's really going to change. And so you find cold comfort in knowledge. And I'm not putting down knowledge. Knowledge is a great thing, but it's not enough. And so then you think, well, what do you have except what you know? And then I would say, you have what you don't know. And there's a lot of that, right? You're never going to run out of what you don't know. And then I would say, well, then maybe what makes the difference between having a life that is acceptable and appropriate and one that's resentful and full of hatred is what sort of relationship you establish with what it is that you don't know. There's always more to learn, and you see in fairy tales and in religious mythology, people are always exhorted to be humble. It's a very annoying thing to be, I would say, but there's a twist on that. It's a very interesting notion, because the humble person isn't exactly meek. The humble person is someone who knows that the expanse of what they don't know supersedes the expanse of what they do know, and so that it's in the encounter with what's not known that all the real information, that's where all the action takes place. And you kind of know that, because when you're really interested in something and it grips you, you know you're right on the edge of where all the information is coming, right? That's what makes it exciting. You know something, but you're on the trail of something you don't know, and that really grips you. And it should grip you, because that's where you're getting all the new information. And I think what music does, as far as I'm concerned, is it speaks to us about what we don't know. It says, look, there's outside of our presuppositions, there's this domain that is constantly patterned and informative and meaningful. And if you're open to it in the appropriate way, which is to pay attention to the limitations of your knowledge and to watch what you're doing in more than a merely intellectual sense, that this unknown patterned expanse is richly informative and sustaining. And I think that every time you listen to a piece of music and it grabs you, that's what it's telling you. And I also think you know that. Now, you don't know it to say it, but there's lots of things you don't know to say. You don't know how to keep your heart beating. You don't know how to walk. I mean, the list of things you don't know is a very long list. And the mere fact that you don't know it doesn't mean that it isn't true. Well, then you ask yourself, with regards to your relationship with something like music, is what it says real or not? And I would say, like pain, what music tells you is so real that it makes other things that are real seem to pale in comparison. Well, you know, I like music a lot, so maybe that's an experience that's idiosyncratic to me. But then you have to explain, I suppose, why music has had such a powerful grip on our culture. Or, well, it's funny, because I read a book on evolutionary psychology a while ago, written by Steven Pinker. It's this big, thick book. There's like one little thin chapter at the end devoted to aesthetics, music, and religion. And I thought, well, that's pretty interesting, you know, because for some people, like aesthetics, religion, and, well, let's say philosophy, is like this much of the book, with the rest of it being this much. And I mean, I'm not really interested in debating that. What I am interested more in saying is that there is a way to understand what it is that our aesthetic experiences tell us. But what they tell us isn't in the language that we normally speak. And the language that aesthetics talks in has something genuine to offer us. It's not epiphenomenal, it's not derivative, it's not secondary, it's fundamental and primary. It's about what things mean and how to act. And for us, that's a big deal, because we need to know how to act. And the arts tell us that, and music tells us that in the most sort of comprehensive and abstract way. It still grips you, though. It grips your body even. It makes you move. It's abstract, but it's concrete at the same time, and you can't argue it away. And if you experience it, you can see exactly what it means. And I think that when you listen to music, what you experience is what you should experience in relationship to reality. And I think it's that observation that does for you what it is that music does for you. And all great art does that, and all great literature. And I would say there's no reason not to assume it's real. That's it.